Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
Well, this is one of the things we talked about earlier. So for those of you who are watching this by video, this is my fly shooter. We have this big fly that's like the size of Granny over here that's flying around the room.
It is an irritant to Jimmy. I told him
So I'm
just
ready.
ignore it. Yes, but he's got the shooter ready here. So
I got my fly shooter. Yep. There's a bug in there from before.
That. I don't want to see that, James.
All right. So on a more serious note,
Yes.
In this episode, we're going to talk about the effects of children and what they feel, what they know, what they sense whenever they're being abused. Because I think this is kind of a big question that a lot of people have is, one, what do they know?
Right.
Because, you know, in speaking to a lot of survivors, they'll tell you, I didn't know that what was happening to me was abuse.
Right.
However, I knew that it was wrong. It didn't feel right.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. And we often don't think about that, what goes on in the child's mind, how they sense or can tell that something is really off, something's really wrong, but they do.
Yeah. So the question, you know, what do they know? And probably on a more practical level, what do they do about it? What do we ask of our children?
Right.
You know, how do we teach them? How do we instruct them? Do we put a whole lot of the onus on them? And is it their responsibility to protect themselves? Or is it a combination of we do it and we teach them to do it, kind of a multi-layered view? And then kind of the third component is when children are abused under the guise that this is what God wants. You know, religion is used as a weapon.
Right.
What does that do to skew their view of God, and what can we do about it? So those are all kind of, maybe those are probably three separate podcasts, or they could be, but we'll try to address them.
We'll see what we come up with today. And I think this is a critical topic, Jimmy, because we have children that are being abused as we speak. We have older children, young adults who are falling away from the church, and they will tell you, I don't want anything to do with God. I don't even know who God is, because they were abused. So we have all these things going on, and we have parents who want to instill a sense of right and wrong to their children. And I like what you said. Do we place this on the child, or is it fully a parent's responsibility? What do we do here? So
yeah.
Critical things to talk about.
And I mean, I have a very vested interest in this. One is as an advocate. Two, just because we were the ones who reported my dad.
Right.
So we know firsthand what damage he created, what carnage he left behind.
Right.
You know, as a trainer, as an instructor, you know, there are a whole lot of reasons why I have a very vested interest in this topic.
And you're a parent. You have
Right.
children. My goodness.
So, yeah, children, there's a scripture that I think about whenever Jesus tells people to become like little children. And I've always heard that used as this cute little passage, basically telling people to become more naive, more humble, innocent, more innocent, like little children. And I'm not so convinced that that's what Jesus meant by that. Because the more I instruct my children, the more I learn from my children, because that's not a one-way street.
Right.
You know, we learn from our children, and we need to learn from our children.
Absolutely.
There's one thing that I've learned in my 10 years now of parenting is that children are incredibly intelligent, that they are a lot smarter, a lot wiser, a lot more discerning than we ever give them credit for.
As a parent now of almost 50 years, I can tell you amen and amen. Children are extremely intuitive, if you want to use that as a word. They know when they should feel a certain fear. They know who they can go to trust. There's an inner sense in a child. They are very smart in that way. Very, very
I'm very smart too. I just want to throw this in here. So I'm your middle child. I'm very smart, but you accuse me of being a smart aleck. So
every now and then, smart aleck is correct terminology. But today, that's not what we're talking about.
No, that's right. But it is, it's very true. My kids, what I see with them is that there's this very important process, and we've talked about this before, but I think it's definitely worth unpacking a little bit here. But there's this process that happens that's agonizing for the parent, and it's working well for the children, and that's the ability to walk them through process,
right?
To think and process and learn and grow and question and say, how does this work?
Why, how, why, when, where, all the time.
And they're constantly asking questions that really annoy us as parents. And we want to just step in and do it ourselves because, the reality is, we can shave, 10 times the amount of time off of anything, from doing dishes to putting toys away to you name it, getting dressed.
It's a lot easier to do it ourselves than to explain how, why, when, where, the process.
Yeah. And exactly. I just went through a 45-minute process this morning of getting my kids dressed, and I refuse to help. And both Natalie and I, we refuse to help our kids get dressed now.
It's a good thing.
And they get distracted, and oh, look, there's, this morning, Isaac, here's a Lego set over here. And he has his pants halfway up his legs.
Yeah.
And he gets distracted, and he's like, oh, look, here's a toy. And then, him and his brother start playing together. And I'm like, focus.
Right.
But that's part of that process, and that's how they learn. And, I think it's so important to teach kids to have discernment. And I think one of my big beefs is that we're seeing a lot of adults who don't have any capability whatsoever to discern whether it's right from wrong, whether it's just having self-awareness and knowing that they're being annoying or abrasive or destructive. There are people who just don't know because they've never been taught.
Right. Okay. Right. Now, in bringing this in focus to what this has to do with abuse, I have talked to many, many children who are now grown up who were abused, who will say, I knew there was something wrong. I was afraid. I was shaking. I was petrified. I knew it was wrong, but I was told this is the way Jesus wants me to love you. This is what God says love is. This is how Grandpa is going to love you, and on and on and on. But the child knew, no, it isn't. No, but the mixed up mess that it causes in the mind is horrible.
Yeah.
Because along with that, the child is being told most often, don't you dare tell. And the child wants to.
And they're being told by parents to respect everybody. You respect adults, respect your teacher, which we should teach. We teach that in my home. But there's an exception clause to that.
Right. And speaking as a mother, like I said, of all of you kids, I never used the exception clause. It was always respect your elders, no matter what. Don't you dare talk back. Don't you dare talk about them. They are your elders. And now if I had to do a retake on that, I would use that clause big and bold, except when you know, feel, or sense that something is wrong, you come to me and you tell me.
Well, also kind of focusing this in on a practical level, just teaching kids to have the terminology to name what could be or is happening to them, to name that as abuse is not enough.
No.
Yes, the terminology has to be there. So, you'll hear in circles of advocacy and books that have been written on sexual abuse, teach your kids proper anatomical names for private parts.
Mm-hmm.
We've been doing that from age 2.
Yeah.
A penis is a penis, a vagina is a vagina. Like, they can name body parts. Right. We don't have little pet names.
We did. Yeah. Sorry,
so,
I come from the age where you didn't
so,
use the real word. As it's
right.
But yes.
So, we don't snicker and giggle and, and all that stuff. We just, from the time they were little, it just was normalized that just like this is a finger or a hand or an arm or a leg, like we have body parts.
Absolutely.
Right. And so proper anatomical names are important, but that's not enough. And so, kind of bringing this all back, we teach our kids that if somebody's making you feel uncomfortable, they're doing something wrong.
Absolutely.
And you have every right to tell them to stop.
Yep.
To express that you're uncomfortable, even if you can't name that as abuse.
If it makes you feel bad or wrong or uncomfortable or afraid, it's wrong.
Right.
Okay.
And we also teach them that their space, however they define that, is sacred. So,
absolutely.
My youngest son, we were just talking about him. He just turned 5, and he is his own person. And
he sure is.
And if something's on his mind, he's going to let you know it. And if he doesn't like something, he'll let you know it.
So
it is good. And we don't discourage that whatsoever. But
good.
He has never liked being kissed anywhere.
No.
And the only place we're not lip kissers with our kids. That's always kind of weirded me out. But we've kissed him on the cheek before, and always from a young age, he would wipe it off and he'd say, "That's gross."
Yeah.
Okay. And so we
For
would talk
him,
about
it is,
that,
right.
and he just doesn't like it. And he
Right.
says, "Kisses are gross. They're wet. They have germs on them."
Right.
And that's just in his mind. He does not like kisses. So guess what we don't do with him?
You respect his...
We don't kiss him.
Absolutely.
If he doesn't like it, we're not going to be like, "Oh, well, it's just a kiss." We tell him too. If other people don't know that you don't like kisses and they try to kiss you, tell them that.
Oh, he told me. I gave him a kiss on
remember
top
seeing
of his
that.
head, and that was the first and last.
I don't like kisses,
let
Graham.
Me know, and I will not do that again. Oh, yeah. I made that mistake. Yes.
So I think it's really important to teach our kids privacy, boundaries, to listen to their sense of when somebody's making them uncomfortable. And that might be different for each people.
It is. And what's interesting? Some of these boundaries don't have to be taught.
Right.
As I'm watching grandchildren now, when they come to the house and maybe they're staying overnight and they're getting ready for bed, it's very interesting to me to see how most of them, starting from around age 4 to 5, will go in the bathroom, close the door, holler, "How do you lock the door, Graham?" and get changed into their PJs. Because it's just they don't feel comfortable doing it out in the open anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And it's
unless you normalize that. And that's
right.
what, that shouldn't be normalized.
Right. And I'm watching now as the preteen ones are doing yesterday, some were changing into a swimsuit. Oh my word. Boarded up everything. They want their privacy. I'm thinking back to myself as around 3rd grade. Oh, I was mortified to have anybody just see me in less than a t-shirt and shorts. Nobody taught me that. My mom and dad didn't teach me that, but it's something that I felt. I set my own boundaries. So you're right, Jimmy. That's innate. That's inborn. There are boundaries that a child will know from very young up.
Yeah. And we also in our home talk about it, and we talk about the importance of privacy and that nobody has a right to violate that.
Right.
And so, nobody ever walks into closed door rooms, be it a bedroom or a bathroom, without knocking.
Right.
We always, everybody.
I wish everybody had
my
that
sibling,
policy. Yes.
my kids with each other, the siblings don't walk in on each other. They knock on each other's doors. And it's just, it's all because we taught them to listen to that and to respect privacy.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So, I think it's really important to have them go through that thinking process, because kids are very intelligent. They're very smart. They sense when things aren't right. Every abuse survivor that I've ever spoken with who's talked about what they felt as a child will 100% of them will say, I knew that what was being done to me wasn't right.
Well, that's
I felt that it was wrong.
And it's so sad to hear that, because then as parents and as friends, we want to say, well, then why didn't you say something? But there's that fear that and also what was told to them, and that fear of not being believed, not being accepted, the guilt that is laid on. Even a child can feel guilt, heavy guilt, and it's horrible. Yeah. It's just awful. What happens to a child when boundaries are, overlooked and when abuse occurs is terrible.
Yeah.
It really is.
So, moving to the second stage of that on a practical level, how much onus do you put on the kids? How much responsibility do you put on their shoulders to say something, to be informed, to take action? I might be in a minority with this, because I know some advocates who are like, it is never the responsibility of the kid. And, because if they're ever abused, they're going to feel guilty because they didn't stop it, and they can't stop the abuse, and on and on and on. And I totally disagree with that. And as with everything, there needs to be balance. So I'm not saying 100% of the responsibility should fall on their shoulders, but the way that I always look at prevention of abuse is we need to put as many tools into the tool belt of everybody, starting from the age of 1 year old, 2 years old. We need to start putting tools in their tool belt that will help them recognize, identify, fend off abusers. And if we're not doing that, we put all the responsibility on adults being trained, and they're the eyes and the ears, and they're the ones who are looking for the signs of abuse and all this red flag behavior that I harp on that does not work.
Right.
We put all of that responsibility on the adults, and my question is, how's that working for us?
It's not, and I'm thinking, my mind is thinking here. We didn't discuss this, of course, prior, all the details of this, but I'm thinking with your dad to that moment when one of your siblings found him viewing hardcore porn.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I never knew as his wife he viewed porn, ever.
Yeah.
Never. It just wasn't him. I mean, this was if you want to call it, a very naive person, I thought. Now, he said he viewed porn with a cousin when he was a kid, and that was in a magazine, but I'm talking hardcore, raunchy, worst of the kind, hardcore porn on a computer.
Mm-hmm.
Your sibling walked in, sees it. I don't know anything about it, but she came to me and shared that. However, and I was so thankful, but, even though he fed a bunch of lies, said he was preparing for a sermon, and I fell head, neck, heels for it. I was like, oh, okay. Well, Dr. Dobson views porn. That's how he wrote about it, So he said, I have to view it if I'm going to talk about it, if I'm going to teach about it.
Wow.
And, right, end of discussion. But it was interesting to me that incident I shared then with you kids by way of an email and said, wow, I don't know where this came from. But then I shared what your dad said. But the abuse that was occurring in our home was not shared until much later. And I'm wondering, had I, as a parent, instilled that and given you kids that tool that I didn't know existed to come to me if anything, there's any sense of wrong or extending beyond boundaries or whatever, I wonder if that would have made a difference. I'm thankful, so very thankful that happened at an older age, but I love what you said about giving our kids as many tools in their toolbox as we can.
Yeah.
We need to do that.
I always have these little soapboxes that I get on and,
I hadn't
with
noticed,
trainings
Jimmy.
and things like that. But part of that is I'm just an analytical thinker, and it's not that I'm necessarily being really critical. It's just that I'm thinking of every perspective,
Right.
every angle, and that's
Right.
just how my brain works. But, a lot of people teach different preventative techniques as if this is going to seal the deal and this is going to be the catch-all to prevent abuse. And it doesn't work that way.
No.
Training your kids, teaching your kids boundaries, teaching them how to speak up when they feel uncomfortable. That's not a fail-safe method to keep them safe. It's a tool. It's helpful. It can help minimize, but that's not like, the end all that's going to keep them from
Right.
ever getting
You need a
abused. I think we're
variety.
naive if we
Right.
think that.
Right. But I guess as being the mother of abused daughters, it runs through my mind often, what if I had spoken about this, but at that point in time, abuse wasn't even talked about in the home. It truly wasn't.
Yeah. So, I personally, what we do is we teach our kids boundaries. We talk about what their boundaries are, kind of their non-negotiables.
Right.
We discuss it, not real often, but just often enough. And, every couple months,
Reminders.
we just kind of casually bring it up in
Refreshers.
conversation.
Okay.
So it's not like we sit our kids down.
No.
I see some
that,
people that are
yeah.
just weirdos with their kids,
Yeah,
and they're like,
no.
making them watch videos on abuse
No.
from a young age. And I'm like, you're nuts. You're insane, and you're going to screw your kids up.
Right.
So, I think there has to be balance. But personally, what we do is, we have blunt but fairly casual conversations about it. We talk about boundaries.
And age appropriate, obviously.
Correct.
Age appropriate.
And
yes.
we talk about some of the techniques that abusers use, sitting them in their laps, the
Right.
progression of hand movement to,
Okay.
to uncomfortable places. So we talk about those sorts of things, not in graphic detail whatsoever,
Right.
but we just say, like, if somebody puts you in that position and you tell them no and they continue anyway, yell, scream, cry out for help. And what we're doing is we're trying to help them overcome that freeze, that natural response that's a freeze. There's flight, fight, and then some people have identified what's a freeze response, where people can't cry out even if they want to.
Right.
Those responses can be overcome with training to a degree. So to whatever degree we can help overcome those different responses, we talk about them. Okay. So we talk about those things, but we never ever give the impression to our kids that if somebody does something anyway, and you're not able to defend yourself, that somehow that's your fault. We never, ever want them to even begin to think that that's their fault, because it's not. So, we talk about this. So we do put some responsibility on the shoulders of our kids in the way of equipping them with different tools.
I like that you're saying that, because if you place the burden on the child.
That's unfair.
Yeah,
that's
awful.
unfair to do that.
And as you're talking and as I'm sitting here thinking, what a child goes through when abuse occurs is something that I don't think we can even compute in our minds unless it's happened personally to us.
I agree.
I really don't think, and when you said, it's fight, flight, or freeze, I have a feeling I'd do all three, even with the education that I have right now.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's why I want to be careful with this and say, well, we teach our kids to overcome freeze, and it, that's a fail-safe method. It's not. That's a visceral response that your body has. It's an automated response, and you may have very little to no control over that. But helping them process through that and realize that is a bodily response. That's helpful.
I love that you're saying that, and I think that's vitally important. As an adult, I've often thought, I live alone. I've thought, okay, what if an intruder comes in, or what if I was ever in a rape situation? I've replayed it in my mind over and over again. Each time it's a different scenario. Mm-hmm. One time I would kick and punch and bite and scream. Another time, I don't think anything could come out of my mouth. I don't know what I would do. But it's important to have at least the ideas in your mind that there is something you can do.
Yeah. So, this is a little bit of a different scenario. Well, no, let me change that. This is a lot different scenario because it's not abuse. And I'm not making this comparison to say that this is similar to abuse, but I think back to my training when I drove truck. And proper instruction and having the right tools in your tool belt, that really is what will make or break somebody as a professional driver who has the capacity in an 80,000 pound vehicle to either be a safe person on the road and protect lives, or to be a weapon who takes lives. I mean, you're talking a massive pile of steel that's a weapon on wheels. If you're not properly trained on how to drive it. So, one of my instructors just grilled into our heads over and over and over and over again. He said, always be thinking of every scenario that could possibly happen. He said, your brain should never stop moving. He said, when you're looking ahead, you're not just turning a steering wheel and pushing a pedal. He said, you're coming up on an intersection. And he said, even if you don't see anybody there, he said, picture a little kid that comes out of the bushes chasing a ball.
I see what you're saying. Yeah,
that comes out where all of a sudden he's there or she's there.
Right.
He said, you always think of every possible scenario and never let your brain stop thinking about those things.
And know ahead of time what your plan is.
That was the single best advice that I ever could have received, because it's impossible to lay out every possible scenario. And it's the same with abuse, and again, I'm not saying that driving truck is anything like abuse.
No, I get it, what you're saying though. I think our viewers will get it also. Our listeners will get it.
My point is when we train, some people will ask me, like, just give me a checklist of all the things that abusers do and all their methods and all that stuff. And I'm like, you can't do it, because if I write down 1 million different scenarios, they've already thought of 3 million more.
Right.
Abusers are very dynamic. They always adapt. They're always changing.
Yes.
So, I think the best tool that we can put in the tool belt of, starting from a young age, well into adulthood, is to teach people to think of all these different scenarios and to think through, if this happens, how am I less surprised by this scenario? And a couple moments where this saved other people's lives. I always felt fairly safe in an 80,000 pound piece of machinery, but it's other people's lives. And there was one instance where I was getting a jab for a hill on Route 30 coming into Breezewood. And treacherous strip. Yeah, it's very windy, very, very hilly, very dangerous. Lots of truck accidents on this road.
Yeah, there are.
But there was a curve as you come up into Breezewood, and it was 4:30 in the morning, and I was getting it pretty good, and I had another coworker of mine behind me, and I came around this corner, and just in a split second, I saw something that reflected back to me. that just at first it looked like animal eyes, like it was an animal.
Mm-hmm.
And right away, I knew I could never stop in time. It was impossible. And within a split second, what I saw was a vehicle, a pickup truck that had rolled upside down.
Oh.
And the passengers that were inside of that pickup truck were crawling out of the windows.
Oh, wow.
And they took up my entire lane.
Yeah.
I was coming around a turn,
Oh, wow.
fully loaded. That had very much potential to be a very bad accident that took 4 people's lives in a second. So I was able to, analyze, think. It didn't surprise, though it surprised me. It didn't, like
you had already
you always
thought
have
a similar scenario.
I had thought of that kind of scenario a million different times.
Right.
And so I knew exactly what to do, and I was able to walk my truck around them. Before I even started to walk around, it happened so quickly. I reached for my microphone on the CB, and I started hollering back to Kim, who was behind me. I was like, left lane, left lane, left lane, left lane, left lane. And I didn't have time to explain what was going on.
Right.
And fortunately, Kim heard the urgency. She knew exactly what was going on, though she couldn't see what was up there.
Okay.
Kim was able to swing out around, and so 2 of us were able to avoid taking 4 people's lives that day. And I could give you 100 of those scenarios that happened while I was driving. And it's just constantly being in that mindset that,
now, of course,
things happen, surprises happen.
We know that a very young child doesn't have that mindset.
No, they can't. No, they can't be that that progressed in their thinking. But they can think of some scenarios.
But we can plant the seeds to where they would at least know this is wrong, which they already would know, and this is what you do. This is you yell, scream. Use the words don't touch or whatever, or, here's the person you go to tell right away. And that could potentially prevent a lot of future abuse.
Yeah. We just need to reframe the way that we think and the way that we teach, the way we instruct, the way we have conversations, conversations at the dinner table. And if we restructure and rethink, that helps us from being paranoid. And people ask that question every time I do a training. How in the world knowing all of this stuff and the way abusers think, and really, like I've worked hard to get into the mind of an abuser, and it's a dark place.
You have.
And so, people inevitably will ask me, how do you keep from being paranoid? And how do you keep us from becoming paranoid hearing the things that we're hearing today? And I say, it all goes back to your training. And, paranoia is so anti-productive, and paranoia plays into the hands of the abuser.
Sure
they're going to use that paranoia,
the fear,
and they're going to actually increase your level of paranoia while they're abusing your kid. So, paranoia is not effective. I don't ever recommend people become paranoid.
No.
I was not a paranoid driver as a truck driver.
Right.
I'm not a paranoid parent. I'm not thinking, oh my goodness, what if my kids are abused today when they go to school?
I think that would drive a parent crazy. Yeah.
I think that's absolute. I don't want to say insanity because that's
no, but by
not
giving
right, but
tools, you feel more secure in what you've given your children.
You just become more equipped.
Right. And I'd like that you and Natalie teach your children. I think when a mother-father team, that's so important within a home.
Absolutely.
Yet we know that, I don't know if it's the majority at this point now of homes do not have a mother-father team. So we have a real, a real
But that
crisis.
doesn't stop you from being able to teach your kids and from them being able to learn.
Right. And, but kids need to know where to go that's safe also.
Yeah.
Trust, which leads into,
That leads into next week's podcast, because we didn't get time to talk about the religion aspect of it.
Right.
And I think that's so important because so many abusers abuse in the name of God. And they tell these kids, this is what God wants of you. This is what he expects of you. This is how we express love to each other. And it's a very poisonous mixed message because the kid knows that it doesn't feel right, but this person's telling me that this is what people do. And so this is what's expected of me.
I heard from the mouth of a 13-year-old girl that her stepdad was raping her, just out and out raping her. He was a minister, and he began the first time by telling her, this is the purest kind of love that you will ever feel. This is how God wants Daddy, as he called himself, to love you. Mm-hmm. And that girl was so messed up mentally with her concept of God, religion, Christians, that she went totally off the wall because of it, and rightly so.
Yeah, I think that's definitely worth an entire episode because it's incredibly common. That's not a fringe group of abusers that use that. Mm-hmm. It's a lot. It's very often. So, I think
it's a burden that lays on our hearts. Those of us who truly want to reach out, help, teach, bring to know God. What should our response be?
Yeah. Well, we will leave you with this truth bomb. I can't heal the wounds of every abuse survivor, but I can be a living example of Christ's love to one. There's so much healing that needs to take place. Yes, there needs to be instruction. We need to add more tools, but there's also healing. And next week we'll really focus in on that, especially when that religious component is brought into it.
Absolutely.
So, once again, we thank you for tuning into this episode, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.